Autumn 1942. The rail yards north of Lyon occupied France. The night is consumed by the rhythmic, deafening chug of a German DRB Class 52 locomotive. Inside the cab, the heat is suffocating, a glowing hellscape illuminated by the open maw of the firebox. A French stoker, conscripted by the occupation, wipes soot from his eyes and swings his shovel. He scrapes a pile of anthracite, black, jagged, and utterly unremarkable. He heaves the load into the roaring furnace. The iron door slams shut. For several minutes, the train continues its surge through the dark countryside, pulling 50 cars of munitions destined for the Eastern Front. Then the pressure gauge spikes violently. There is no whistle of an incoming bomb, no crack of a sniper's rifle. Just an instantaneous catastrophic rupture. The boiler explodes with the force of a thunderclap, tearing the steel locomotive apart from the inside out and derailing the convoy in a screeching tangle of metal. When German investigators arrive at the smoking crater hours later, they find nothing but debris. They blame a mechanical failure, unaware that the true cause burned away completely, in the blast. It was a weapon that left no fragments, no evidence, and no explanation. Only twisted steel and a paralyzed war machine. June 1940. The map of Europe had been redrawn in the span of 6 weeks. The fall of France was not just a defeat, it was a total collapse of the geopolitical order. The British Expeditionary Force had been miraculously evacuated from the beaches of Dunkirk, but they had left their heavy equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, burning on the sands. Across the English Channel, the Third Reich stood triumphant, its dominion stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Pyrenees. For the first time in centuries, Britain stood completely alone against a unified, hostile continent. The strategic reality facing Winston Churchill's war cabinet was bleak. The Wehrmacht possessed the finest fighting force in the world, hardened by victory and fueled by the resources of conquered nations. A direct amphibious invasion of Europe to liberate France was, at this juncture, a suicidal fantasy. The Royal Air Force was locked in a desperate struggle just to keep the Luftwaffe at bay during the Battle of Britain. The Royal Navy could police the seas, but they could not project power inland. If the Allies were to continue the war, they had to reinvent the very nature of combat. They could not fight a war of fronts. They had to fight a war of nerves. It was in this atmosphere of existential dread that Churchill issued a directive that would fundamentally alter the rules of engagement. On July 22, 1940, he authorized the creation of the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. His order to its first director, Hugh Dalton, was simple, theatrical, and terrifyingly vague. Set Europe ablaze. This was not a mandate for conventional military operations. It was the formalization of ungentlemanly warfare. The British military establishment, steeped in the traditions of honor and open battle, viewed the SOE with deep suspicion, referring to it derisively as the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. They argued that sabotage, assassination, and subversion were the tools of terrorists, not soldiers. Churchill, however, understood what the generals did not. The German war machine was a massive industrial organism. Like any organism, it needed to eat. It required a ceaseless flow of raw materials, steel from Sweden, oil from Romania, coal from the Ruhr Valley, to sustain its occupation. The strength of the Third Reich was its industrial capacity, but this was also its Achilles heel. The vast network of supply lines required to feed the German army was stretched thin across thousands of miles of hostile territory. The SOE's mission was to turn every occupied village, every factory floor, and every rail depot into a potential battlefield. They needed to weaponize the resistance movements of Poland, France, Norway, and the Netherlands. But willing hands needed tools. The resistance fighters could not operate heavy artillery or fly bombers. They needed weapons that were concealable, easily transported, and devastatingly effective. They needed devices that a lone operative could carry in a pocket, slip into a facility unnoticed, and walk away from before the destruction began. Traditional aerial bombing was proving to be a blunt and often ineffective instrument against specific industrial targets. In 1940 and 1941, RAF Bomber Command struggled with accuracy. Reports indicated that only a fraction of bombs fell within 5 miles of their intended targets. While bombers could flatten cities, they often missed the critical nodes of infrastructure, the switches, the power stations, and the locomotives that kept the German army moving. The cost of losing a Lancaster bomber and its highly trained crew to German flak just to destroy a few yards of railway track was unsustainably high. Tracks could be repaired in hours by forced labor battalions. To truly hurt the enemy, the Allies needed to destroy the machines that ran on the tracks. This necessity drove the war underground into the laboratories of the SOE. The scientists and engineers recruited for this task were not typical military men. They were eccentric inventors, chemists, and stage magicians tasked with solving a deadly puzzle. How do you destroy a heavy industrial machine right under the noses of the SS without leaving a trace? The answer would not come from a massive new bomb, but from understanding the specific diet of the steam engine. To understand why a piece of fake coal became a strategic obsession, one must first grasp the colossal scale of the Deutsche Reichsbahn, the German Imperial Railway. By 1941, the German logistics network was not merely a transportation system. It was the bloodstream of the entire European conquest. While propaganda reels often showed panzer divisions thundering across open plains, the reality of German logistics was far more rigid and rail-bound. The Wehrmacht was chronically short of rubber for trucks and fuel for motorized transport. The vast majority of supplies, ammunition, tank parts, food, and reinforcements moved by rail. The occupation of Europe required a schedule of terrifying precision. Every day, thousands of trains crisscrossed the continent. They moved coal from the Ruhr to the steelworks of Italy. They transported troops from France to the freezing steppes of Russia. They carried the plundered resources of the East back to the factories of the Reich. If the train stopped, the war stopped. A panzer division without fuel is nothing but a collection of static steel pillboxes. An infantry regiment without ammunition is a crowd of refugees in uniform. Allied strategists quickly realized that the railway system was the German army's center of gravity. However, attacking it proved maddeningly difficult. The resistance and the SOE initially focused on blowing up tracks. Operatives would risk their lives to plant charges on remote sections of the line, successfully derailing a train or severing a route. But the Germans were ruthlessly efficient engineers. They established dedicated railway repair battalions, often using slave labor, who could replace a blown section of track in a matter of hours. A line severed at midnight could be operational by dawn. The disruption was temporary, a mere annoyance to the logistical planners in Berlin. The equation changed when one looked at the locomotive itself. A steam locomotive is a marvel of thermal engineering, but it is also a fragile, high-pressure bomb waiting to go off. The boiler operates under immense pressure, containing superheated steam that drives the pistons. If that pressure vessel is breached while under load, the result is not a simple breakdown. It is a catastrophic thermal explosion. The blast wave shreds the metal skin of the engine. The sudden release of steam scalds the crew instantly, and the physical deformation of the chassis often twists the rails beneath it so severely that the line remains closed for days, not hours. More importantly, a locomotive is complex. Unlike a section of rail, which is just rolled steel, a locomotive requires precision manufacturing: valves, pistons, gauges, and high-grade steel. By 1942, as Allied bombing raids began to pound German industrial cities, the production of new locomotives slowed. The Germans responded by creating the Kriegslokomotive, simplified austerity designs, like the BR-52, stripping away non-essential parts to speed up production. But even these simplified beasts took weeks to build and required specialized factories. The logic was cold and mathematical. Destroying 100 yards of track cost the Germans a few hours of labor. Destroying a single locomotive cost them a machine that took thousands of man-hours to replace. If the Allies could find a way to systematically destroy the rolling stock, they could induce a transportation paralysis that would leave German armies stranded at the front. But the tactical problem remained. Rail yards were heavily guarded. Locomotives were mobile targets. Placing a magnetic mine on the side of a train required an agent to get physically close to the target, often under floodlights and machine gun watchtowers. The casualty rate for such sabotage missions was horrific. The SOE needed a weapon that bypassed the guards entirely. They needed a device that could be introduced into the system miles away from the target, perhaps at a coaling station or a depot, and lie dormant until the inevitable moment it was shoveled into the fire. The solution lay in the fuel itself. The steam engines devoured coal by the ton. The coal piles at depots were often unguarded mountains of black rock. If a saboteur could introduce an explosive that looked exactly like a lump of coal, the enemy would do the work for them. The stoker would act as the unwitting executioner, shoveling the weapon into the heart of the machine. It was a concept of devious brilliance. Turn the enemy's logistics against itself. The task of creating this camouflage fell to a top-secret research facility in Hertfordshire, England, known simply as Station 9. It was here, in a quiet country manor, that the art of war was being rewritten by a collection of eccentric geniuses who would turn a lump of plastic explosive into the most insidious weapon of the railway war. The weapon that would haunt the German railways was born not in a factory, but in a confiscated Georgian mansion in Hertfordshire called the Fryth. To the locals, it was a mysterious government facility. To the intelligence community, it was Station 9. This was the SOE's toy shop, a place where the laws of convention were suspended in favor of lethal creativity. The engineers at Station 9 were presented with a problem that was more artistic than ballistic: how to make a bomb that didn't look like a bomb. It had to pass the glance test of a tired, overworked stoker. It had to sit in a pile of real coal, exposed to rain, sun, and rough handling, without degrading. And crucially, it had to detonate only when it was inside the firebox, not when it was being shoveled or thrown. The first prototypes were crude, hollowed-out pieces of real coal filled with dynamite. But these were dangerous to drill and structurally weak. A heavy shovel strike could crack them open, revealing the explosive inside, or, worse, detonating them prematurely in a coal yard. The team realized they needed a synthetic casing. They turned to real coal samples stolen from German supply lines. They studied the fracture patterns, the sheen, and the specific density of anthracite versus lignite. The breakthrough came with the use of plastic explosives. specifically a malleable compound known as Nobel 808. This stable dough-like explosive could be molded into irregular shapes, but raw explosive doesn't look like coal. The technicians developed a composite skin, a mixture of plaster, real coal dust, and varnish, that could be painted and textured to match the local fuel supplies perfectly. This attention to detail was obsessive but necessary. A German stoker in Italy shoveled a different type of coal than a stoker in Norway. In the Mediterranean, the trains ran on pressed coal briquettes. In the Ruhr, they used raw lumps of anthracite. Station 9 had to manufacture a bespoke explosive coal for each theatre of war. They created molds for the distinct brick-like briquettes used by Italian railways and jagged, irregular molds for the French lines. Inside this camouflage shell lay the detonator. It was a simple but ingenious pressure heat trigger. The device was safe to handle at room temperature. You could drop it, stack it, or throw it into a tender without incident. But once inside the firebox, the intense heat would burn through the outer casing. Within seconds, the detonator would fire, igniting the main charge of plastic explosive. The placement was critical. By exploding inside the firebox, the blast didn't just blow outwards. It utilized the boiler's own pressure against it, turning the water and steam into a devastating, expansive force. The team at Station 9 even considered the sound. A lump of coal makes a specific clack when it hits a metal shovel. A dull thud might arouse suspicion. While perfect auditory mimicry was impossible, the hardened outer shell of the coal torpedo was designed to sound sufficiently stone-like to pass unnoticed in the cacophony of a busy rail yard. They had created the perfect assassin, silent, invisible, and patient. The genius of Station 9 would have been meaningless without a delivery system. But unlike the V-2 rocket or the Lancaster bomber, the delivery system for the coal torpedo was human. It relied on a clandestine network of flesh and blood. The men and women of the SOE and the local resistance circuits. This supply chain was one of the most perilous logistical feats of the war. The journey of a single piece of explosive coal began in the belly of an RAF Halifax bomber, dropping supplies by parachute into a moonlit field in the Loire Valley, or the outskirts of Oslo. From there, it passed into the hands of a reception committee. These were farmers, teachers, and shopkeepers living double lives. They collected the canisters, burying the Sten guns and radios. But the coal required different handling. For a resistance operative, the coal torpedo was a uniquely terrifying object to transport. A gun feels like a weapon. It gives a sense of power. A radio is a link to the outside world. But a piece of explosive coal is an innocuous, heavy lump that offers no defense. To move it, agents had to rely entirely on their cover. Picture a young French courier cycling through a German checkpoint. In her basket, beneath a layer of onions and bread, sits a lump of anthracite capable of derailing a troop transport. A German sentry stops her, rummages through the basket, his hand brushing against the coal. He feels nothing but a rock. He waves her through. This was the psychological reality of the operation. The weapon's greatest defense was its banality. The tactical deployment of the device was equally subtle. Saboteurs did not need to fight their way into the locomotive cab. They simply needed to access the fuel source. The coal tenders, the open wagons trailing the locomotives, were often left unattended in sidings. A resistance fighter posing as a rail worker could walk past a tender, casually toss the device onto the top of the pile, and keep walking. This created a time bomb effect that was impossible to predict. The device might be shoveled into the furnace 10 minutes later, or it might sit in the tender 4 days as the train crossed borders. A piece of coal planted in Paris might detonate in Belgium. This geographic disconnect protected the saboteur. By the time the explosion occurred, the person who planted it was miles away, sleeping in their own bed, with no direct link to the crime scene. The SOE also exploited the enemy's own labor force. In many occupied zones, the Germans relied on forced labor to load the trains. These workers, starving and resentful, were all too eager to mix a special piece of coal into the chutes. In North Africa, the OSS, the American precursor to the CIA, adopted the tactic, paying local workers to infiltrate the coal supplies of the German logistical lines in Tunisia. The weapon democratized sabotage. One did not need to be a trained commando to cripple a train. One only needed the courage to carry a rock. However, the angles of this operation also included a bizarre technological sibling. The success of the coal torpedo emboldened the Station 9 engineers to push the concept of camouflage even further. If coal worked, what else could hide a bomb? This line of thinking led to the infamous explosive rat. The idea was to skin a dead rat, fill it with plastic explosives, and leave it near a boiler room, assuming a German stoker would shovel the carcass into the fire to dispose of it. While the rat bomb never saw the widespread success of the coal torpedo, the first batch was intercepted by German intelligence, leading to a fascinating internal memo where the Nazis anxiously searched for thousands of non-existent rat bombs. It illustrated the audacious mindset of the time. The goal was to make the enemy paranoid of everything: the coal, the rats, the soap, the very environment they occupied. By late 1942, the stage was set. The laboratories had perfected the chemistry. The networks had established the supply lines. The coal was in the tenders. The weapon was no longer a theory. It was about to become a plague upon the German railway system. By 1943, the war had shifted. The initial desperation of 1940 was gone, replaced by a grinding industrial attrition. In the Mediterranean, the Allies were pushing up through Italy. On the Eastern Front, the Soviet Union was chewing through German armor at Kursk. And in the shadowy world of the railways, the coal torpedo operation was escalating from isolated experiments into a continental campaign. The Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services began flooding the supply lines. The coal was no longer just a curiosity. It was a standard issue item for field agents operating near logistical hubs. In the Balkans, Greek and Yugoslav partisans, already masters of ambush, embraced the weapon with ferocity. They didn't just target the locomotives, they targeted the uncertainty of the enemy. Imagine the scene at a coaling station near Salonika, Greece. The sun beats down on the iron rails, the air thick with the smell of creosote and sulfur. A partisan, disguised as a day laborer, moves toward a waiting locomotive tender. He carries a burlap sack over his shoulder, seemingly filled with tools or lunch. In reality, mixed among the mundane items is a single heavy lump of painted plastic explosive. The tension in these moments was suffocating. This was not a firefight where adrenaline takes over. This was a slow, deliberate walk into the lion's den. The yard is crawling with Feldgendarmerie, the German military police, who patrol with dogs, checking papers and inspecting cargo. The saboteur knows that if he is searched, there is no explaining away the rock that smells faintly of almonds, or feels slightly too greasy to be coal. He reaches the tender. He doesn't look around furtively. That would draw attention. He acts bored, tired. He leans against the wagon, wipes his brow, and with a casual shrug, empties the debris from his sack into the mountain of coal. The torpedo tumbles down the black slope, clattering against real anthracite, disappearing instantly into the pile. The act is done. There is no click, no beep, no fuse burning down. The saboteur walks away, his part of the mission complete. But the weapon is now live, a silent predator waiting in the darkness of the tender. The train departs an hour later, pulling 20 flatbeds of artillery shells north toward the Danube. For 50 miles, nothing happens. The fireman shovels scoop after scoop, working his way through the pile. The torpedo slides closer to the chute with every shovel load. The genius of the design was in this delay. The train clears the station, clears the checkpoints, and enters the open country. It is moving at 40 miles per hour, a distinct rhythm of steel on steel. The crew feels safe. They are far from the partisan ambushes in the hills. They are just doing a job. Inside the cab, the fireman's shovel hits the disguised charge. He doesn't notice the weight difference. It's within a few ounces of the real thing. He swings the door open. The firebox is a blinding white-hot vortex, burning at over 1,100 degrees Celsius. He throws the load in. The door swings shut. The coal lands on the grate. The outer casing, the plaster and coal dust, vaporizes instantly. The heat penetrates the core. The detonator triggers. The build-up is silent, invisible, and inevitable. It is the calm before the mechanical storm. The weapon has bypassed the armor, the guards, and the flak towers. It is now inside the beast, and there is no way to stop it. The explosion that follows is not a cinematic fireball of gasoline. It is a violent release of pressurized physics. Inside the firebox, the plastic explosive detonates with a sharp, high-velocity crack. In an open field, this charge might only kill a man within a few meters. But confined within the firebox of a steam locomotive, the physics are entirely different. The blast wave hammers against the firebox walls, which are already under immense stress, holding back the boiler's water and steam pressure. The steel plates, weakened by the heat and hammered by the shock wave, fail catastrophically. In a fraction of a second, the high-pressure water in the boiler is exposed to atmospheric pressure. It flashes instantly into steam, expanding 1,600 times its volume in the blink of an eye. The locomotive ceases to be a vehicle and becomes a bomb. The boiler rips open, tearing the locomotive's chassis in half. The heavy steel plating is shredded like paper. The force of the blast blows the cab apart, instantly killing the driver and the fireman. But the destruction does not stop there. The sudden deceleration and the twisting of the frame send a shockwave down the coupling hooks. The tender jackknifes, the flatbeds behind it, carrying tons of artillery shells, slam into the wreckage. The screech of tearing metal echoes across the valley as the train derails. Cars pile atop one another in a chaotic, tangled heap of steel and wood. The rails beneath the engine are twisted into pretzels, the sleepers splintered into matchsticks. Silence returns to the valley, broken only by the hiss of escaping steam and the groans of the dying train. When the dust settles, the strategic victory is absolute. It is not just the loss of a locomotive, though that it is significant. It is the blockage. The wreck sits like a dead whale across the main supply artery. A recovery crane will take days to arrive. The track will need to be rebuilt from the ballast up. For the next week, no supplies will move on this line. The artillery shells destined for the front will not arrive. The reinforcements will be delayed. German investigators arrive within the hour. They crawl through the wreckage, looking for the telltale signs of sabotage. Wires, timers, fragments of a mine casing. They find nothing. The coal torpedo has consumed itself in the act of destruction. The plastic explosive burned away. The plaster casing disintegrated into dust, indistinguishable from the ash in the firebox. The investigators are left with a maddening conclusion: a mechanical failure. They blame the dead crew. They blame the steel quality. They blame the maintenance schedule. They do not blame the coal. The sabotage has succeeded not only in destroying the target, but in hiding the very fact that a battle took place. The enemy has been struck by a ghost. The immediate aftermath of a coal torpedo strike was defined by a specific, suffocating silence. The silence of a mystery that refused to be solved. As the wreckage was cleared and the twisted metal hauled away, the German military bureaucracy began its grim work. But unlike a derailment caused by a visible explosion on the tracks, where a crater and explosive residue would clearly point to partisan activity, these incidents presented a forensic void. Technicians from the Reichsbahn would sift through the cold ash of the firebox, looking for the signature of a British device. They found nothing. The explosive had chemically converted into gas. The casing had become dust. To the German investigators, the evidence pointed to only one conclusion: operator error or low-quality steel. This incorrect diagnosis triggered a wave of internal terror within the German railway personnel that was arguably more damaging than the explosions themselves. The Gestapo and the railway police, desperate to assign blame, turned on their own men. Innocent stokers and engineers were accused of negligence. They were interrogated, stripped of their ranks, and in some cases executed for sabotage through incompetence. A report from the SOE archives later highlighted this psychological dividend. By making the enemy believe their own machinery was failing, the Allies sowed distrust between the German command and the workers who kept the trains moving. Stokers began to fear their own fuel. Every shovel of coal became a potential death sentence. This hesitation slowed operations. Crews became overly cautious, inspecting coal piles with paranoid intensity, delaying departures and disrupting the tight schedules required by the front lines. The strategic impact was cumulative. One destroyed locomotive was a nuisance, but hundreds of unexplained boiler explosions created a statistical nightmare for the Wehrmacht. In the run-up to D-Day in 1944 and during the desperate defense of the Reich in 1945, the attrition rate of German locomotives spiked. While the Allies were bombing rail yards from the sky, the coal torpedoes were rotting the system from the inside. Trains carrying vital panzer reinforcements to Normandy broke down mysteriously miles from the front. Ammunition, destined for the defense of Berlin, vanished in plumes of steam on the Polish plains. The ghost war on the rails meant that for every train that arrived, the German high command had to wonder how many more wouldn't make it. The weapon had achieved the ultimate goal of sabotage. It didn't just destroy equipment, it destroyed confidence. The success of the British SOE's coal campaign did not go unnoticed by their American counterparts. The Office of Strategic Services, eager to prove its worth in the shadow of British intelligence, adopted the technology with characteristic industrial enthusiasm. They didn't just copy the coal, they refined it. The OSS developed their own variants for the Pacific theater, creating coal that mimicked the charcoal used on Japanese riverboats and trains in Burma and China. They produced camouflaged incendiaries designed to look like firewood, intended to burn down military barracks when soldiers used them for heating. The concept of booby-trapping the environment became a core doctrine of American special operations, a lineage that traces directly from the coal piles of 1943 to the sophisticated electronic sabotage of the Cold War. But the numbers tell the starkest story. Post-war analysis suggests that the cost of producing a single coal torpedo was negligible. A few pounds of plastic explosive, some plaster, and paint. In contrast, a German DRB Class 52 locomotive cost hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks and required thousands of man-hours to build. Historians estimate that hundreds of locomotives were damaged or destroyed by these devices. The exchange rate was staggering. For the price of a dinner in London, the Allies could destroy a machine worth a fortune. It was the ultimate asymmetry. However, the legacy of the coal torpedo extends beyond the balance sheet. It marked a shift in the morality of warfare. It blurred the lines between combatant and mechanic, between the battlefield and the workplace. It proved that in total war, nothing is safe, not even the fuel in your engine. By 1945, as the Allied armies swept across the Rhine, they found rail yards littered with the skeletons of locomotives that had seemingly torn themselves apart. To the advancing troops, they were just wrecks. But to the intelligence officers walking amidst the ruin, they were the silent monuments to the most successful sabotage campaign in history. The weapon had worked so well that even in defeat, the enemy still didn't know what had hit them. The story of the coal torpedo is not just a footnote in the history of World War II. It is a profound lesson in the power of ingenuity over brute force. We often remember the war for its titans, the Tiger tanks, the B-17 flying fortresses, the battleships. We obsess over the weapons that made the most noise. But the coal torpedo reminds us that the most dangerous weapon is often the one you cannot see. It was a victory of mind over matter. A handful of eccentrics in an English manor house looked at a lump of coal and saw a way to stop an empire. They proved that if you cannot fight the enemy's strength, you must poison his strength. You must make him afraid to move, afraid to refuel, afraid to exist. In the end, the German war machine wasn't just crushed by the weight of Allied bombs. It was also dismantled, piece by piece, by a rock that wasn't a rock, thrown by a hand that never held a gun. It remains the perfect crime of the 20th century. A weapon that destroyed the evidence of its own existence, leaving behind only silence and steam.